Emily noticed the silence long before anyone else did, because silence had become her closest companion since she married Mark and moved into his quiet suburban home outside Portland, where tall pine trees framed the backyard and rain tapped softly against the windows most evenings. The house was warm and comfortable, yet something invisible stood between her and David, Mark's 19-year-old son, who had returned from his first year of college carrying more weight in his eyes than in his suitcase. From the first day she stepped into that house as a wife and stepmother, Emily promised herself she would not force affection or demand respect. She would earn trust slowly, brick by brick, even if it took years. David was polite but distant, offering short replies at dinner, disappearing into his room with headphones on, keeping his emotions guarded like fragile glass. Emily understood why. He had lost his mother to illness when he was young, and grief had shaped him into someone careful with his heart. She never tried to replace that memory. Instead, she focused on simple acts that spoke louder than speeches. She kept his favorite cereal stocked, learned how he liked his coffee, asked about his classes without pushing too hard. Still, there was a gap, wide and quiet, that neither of them knew how to cross. One gray Sunday afternoon, when Mark left early for a work shift at the hospital, Emily found herself alone in the kitchen, staring at the apples she had bought from the local farmer's market. The house felt heavier than usual, almost restless. She decided to bake her mother's apple cinnamon pie, the same recipe that once filled her childhood home in Ohio with warmth during long winters. As she peeled apples and mixed sugar with spice, memories flowed through her, her mother humming old songs, flour dusting the counter, laughter rising like steam. Baking had always been her way of speaking love without words. The scent of cinnamon soon drifted through the hallway, slipping under doors, soft and inviting. Upstairs, David paused while studying. He hadn't eaten much that day, too distracted by thoughts about school, his uncertain major, and the quiet fear that he might disappoint his father. The smell reached him and stirred something gentle inside, a reminder of a time when life felt simpler. Without fully deciding to, he walked down the stairs and stopped at the kitchen doorway. Emily noticed him immediately but pretended not to, giving him space to step in on his own. The pie rested on the counter, golden and glowing under the kitchen light. For a second, neither spoke. Then she wiped her hands on a towel and offered a small smile. "I just took it out of the oven," she said softly. "Would you like to taste it?" It was a simple sentence, yet it carried weeks of quiet effort and unspoken hope. David looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected to be included in something so warm and ordinary. He hesitated, not because he didn't want the pie, but because accepting it felt like accepting her presence in his life. Emily sensed the hesitation and kept her voice steady. "No pressure," she added lightly. "I just need someone honest to tell me if I burned it." A faint smile touched his lips at that. He stepped into the kitchen, the first time in days he had entered without being called for dinner. Emily cut a small slice and placed it carefully on a plate, the crust flaky, the filling still steaming. She handed him a fork and waited. David took a bite, and for a moment his guarded expression melted. The flavors were warm, balanced, comforting. He swallowed and looked at her, genuinely caught off guard. "It's really good," he admitted, and there was something vulnerable in his tone, like he had just confessed more than an opinion about dessert. Emily felt a quiet relief settle in her chest. They stood side by side at the counter, sharing that small space. The rain outside grew stronger, but inside, something softer formed. David took another bite, slower this time. "My mom used to bake," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the memory. Emily didn't interrupt. She simply listened, giving him room to continue. He spoke about Saturday mornings, about music playing in the background, about how his mother would let him taste the filling before it went into the oven. His voice wasn't heavy with sadness, it was gentle, reflective. Emily nodded. "That sounds beautiful," she said sincerely. There was no jealousy in her heart, only respect for the memory. She understood that love doesn't compete, it adds. The conversation flowed more easily after that. David shared pieces of his college life, the pressure to choose a path, the fear of failing, the loneliness of being away from home. Emily responded not with lectures, but with understanding. She told him about her own uncertain years, about changing careers before finding work she truly cared about learning that life rarely moves in straight lines. Her honesty surprised him. He had expected advice, instead, he received empathy. The pie cooled between them, half gone before they noticed. For the first time, the kitchen didn't feel like neutral territory, it felt shared. When David finished his slice, he lingered instead of retreating upstairs. "Thanks," he said quietly, and the word carried more weight than gratitude for dessert. Emily smiled, recognizing the shift but not drawing attention to it. She knew trust grows best when it isn't forced into the spotlight. As evening approached and the rain softened, David offered to wash the dishes without being asked. It was a small gesture, but to Emily, it felt like the opening of a door that had been closed for too long. Later that night, when Mark returned home tired from work, he noticed the subtle change in the air, the way David spoke more openly at dinner, the way Emily's laughter came easier. He didn't ask what had happened, and they didn't explain. Some things are too simple and too important to reduce to words. Upstairs, before going to bed, David paused outside the kitchen once more, glancing at the remaining pie covered carefully with foil. He realized the surprise he felt earlier wasn't just about taste, it was about being seen, being invited, being welcomed without expectation. And downstairs, as Emily turned off the lights, she felt something close to hope. She hadn't tried to replace anyone or rush affection. She had only offered a slice of pie and a quiet presence. Yet in that small act, a bridge had begun to form across the silence that once filled the house. The days after that Sunday felt different, not dramatic but lighter, as if fresh air had moved through the house and opened windows no one realized were shut. David no longer rushed upstairs after dinner, and Emily no longer wondered if every word she spoke sounded forced, because something natural had started to grow between them, something built on small talks and shared space rather than big, emotional speeches. On Monday evening, David came home from meeting a friend and found Emily in the kitchen again, this time making pasta, soft music playing from her phone on the counter, and instead of walking past with a quick greeting, he leaned against the doorway and asked, almost casually, "Need any help?" The question surprised them both, but Emily didn't show it. She handed him a cutting board and asked him to slice tomatoes, and they worked side by side in a rhythm that felt steady, like they had done this for years. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was calm. As they cooked, David talked about his business class, about how everyone else seemed confident while he felt unsure, about how social media made it look like people his age already had life figured out. Emily listened carefully, nodding, letting him finish without interruption. She told him that confidence often grows from trying and failing quietly before anyone sees success, and she shared how she once changed her career path at 25 because she realized she had been chasing approval instead of purpose. David looked at her differently then, not as someone who had everything sorted out, but as someone who understood confusion. Later that week, when rain poured heavily outside and Mark was stuck at work again, the power flickered but stayed on, and the two of them ended up in the living room with mugs of hot chocolate Emily had made on impulse. David scrolled through his phone at first, then locked it and placed it face down. "Can I ask you something?" he said carefully, like stepping into deeper water. Emily nodded. He asked if it was wrong to feel angry sometimes, even years after losing someone, even when life seemed stable now. The question wasn't loud, but it carried years of unspoken emotion. Emily didn't rush to comfort him with clichés. She told him anger can be part of grief, that it doesn't mean you're ungrateful for the present, and that healing doesn't follow a calendar. Her voice was calm, steady, never trying to claim a role she didn't have. David listened, absorbing her words slowly. He admitted he sometimes felt guilty for laughing or enjoying life, as if happiness meant forgetting. Emily shook her head gently and said remembering someone with love doesn't require carrying pain forever. The room felt warmer after that conversation, not because of the heater but because honesty had replaced distance. Over the next few days, David started lingering more often in shared spaces. He asked about Emily's childhood in Ohio, about what her mother was like, about why she loved baking so much. Emily spoke about snowy winters, about her father teaching her patience, about how her mother believed food could heal more than hunger. David smiled at that and said maybe that's why the pie tasted safe. The word stayed with Emily. Safe meant trust, and trust meant progress. One Friday night, Mark suggested ordering takeout, but David surprised them both by saying he'd rather cook at home. He looked at Emily and said, maybe you can show me that recipe again. Mark noticed the shift clearly now, his relief quiet but real. In the kitchen, flour dusted the counter once more, and David followed instructions carefully, sometimes laughing at his own mistakes. Emily guided him but let him lead, allowing him to feel capable rather than corrected. When the pie baked in the oven, filling the house with warmth again, David leaned back against the counter and said softly, "It feels different here lately." Emily didn't ask him to explain, she already knew. The house felt less like a place divided by roles and more like a home shaped by effort. David admitted he had expected tension after his father remarried, expected awkward dinners and forced smiles, but instead he found patience. Emily responded gently that building something meaningful takes time, and she never wanted him to feel replaced or pressured. He nodded, understanding that her care wasn't about stepping into his mother's place but about standing beside him in the present. As the weeks moved forward, their conversations deepened without becoming complicated. They talked about future goals, about fear of failure, about friendships that fade and new ones that grow. Emily encouraged David to apply for an internship he felt unqualified for, reminding him that courage often matters more than perfection. He hesitated but eventually submitted the application. The day he received an interview invitation, he came home excited, holding his phone up like proof that belief can lead to opportunity. Without thinking, he hugged her briefly, a quick, grateful gesture that caught them both off guard but felt natural. Emily smiled, her heart full, not because she needed validation but because she saw him stepping into his own confidence. Later that night, as she washed dishes alone, she reflected on how a simple offer to taste pie had opened the door to something deeper. Not dramatic love, not blurred lines, but steady connection built on respect. David, in his room, felt lighter too. He no longer saw Emily as an outsider trying to fill space, he saw her as someone choosing to show up consistently, without demand. The surprise he once felt in the kitchen had transformed into appreciation. And though neither of them spoke about it directly, both understood that this new bond required care and clarity. It was not about replacing the past or rewriting history. It was about creating present moments strong enough to stand on their own. As winter slowly shifted toward spring, the house no longer echoed with quiet distance. Instead, it carried shared laughter, honest talks, and the comforting truth that family can grow in unexpected ways when kindness is offered freely and accepted with courage. By early spring, the house no longer felt divided, yet Emily sensed a new kind of tension building, not negative but delicate, like thin glass that needed careful handling. David had grown more open, more expressive, and with that openness came emotions he did not always understand. One evening after dinner, Mark left for a weekend medical conference in Chicago, trusting that everything at home was steady, and for the first time it was just Emily and David in the quiet house for 2 full days. The air felt different, not uncomfortable, but aware. They spent Saturday cleaning the garage, laughing over old photo albums Mark had stored away, and David asked questions about his father's younger years, stories he had never heard before. Emily shared what she knew, careful not to speak over memories that belonged to David. As they sat on the floor surrounded by boxes, David found an old family picture of his parents from years ago. He grew quiet, staring at it longer than usual. Emily watched his expression shift from nostalgia to something heavier. "Do you ever feel like you don't know where you belong?" he asked suddenly, his voice low but steady. The question surprised her because it was deeper than anything he had asked before. She took a slow breath and answered honestly, telling him that blending families can feel like stepping into a story already in progress, and sometimes it takes time to find your place in the chapters ahead. David nodded but didn't look convinced. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in unexpectedly, rain hitting the windows hard, wind shaking the trees. The lights flickered once and then went out completely, leaving the house wrapped in darkness. Emily found candles and placed them around the living room, their soft glow casting long shadows on the walls. David sat across from her on the couch, the storm loud outside but the room quiet between them. In the dim light, emotions felt closer to the surface. "You've been there for me more than I expected," he admitted, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Sometimes I don't know what to call what I feel." Emily understood the weight behind those words. She knew he was not speaking about romance or confusion in that way, he was speaking about connection that arrived when he needed guidance most. She leaned forward slightly, her tone calm and firm. "What you feel is trust," she said gently. "And trust can be strong without being complicated." David listened closely. He admitted that after losing his mother, he had built walls so high he didn't think anyone would reach him again, and when Emily showed patience instead of pressure, it unsettled him at first. He had expected distance, maybe polite indifference, but not steady support. Emily told him that caring for someone doesn't mean replacing anyone else, it means respecting the past while building something healthy in the present. The storm outside softened, but inside the conversation deepened. David confessed he sometimes feared growing too attached, worried that closeness could disappear again. Emily shook her head softly and reminded him that relationships based on honesty and boundaries are not fragile, they are built to last. She placed her hand over his briefly, a grounding gesture, not emotional in a dramatic way but reassuring. "You're not alone here," she said clearly. "But we also keep things healthy and clear. That's what makes it real." David exhaled slowly, as if releasing weeks of silent confusion. He realized that the warmth he felt was not misplaced attraction or blurred emotion, it was the relief of having someone present without conditions. The storm faded completely, leaving only the sound of rain dripping from the roof. They talked for hours that night about future plans, about internships, about moving to New York one day, about Emily's dream of opening a small bakery after Mark retired. The conversation felt balanced, mature, respectful. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, bright and clean. The house no longer felt tense, it felt clarified. David woke early and started making pancakes before Emily even came downstairs, wanting to show appreciation in a simple way. When she entered the kitchen, surprised by the smell of breakfast, he smiled with quiet confidence. "Figured I could return the favor," he said. Emily laughed softly, proud not because she needed recognition but because she saw growth in him. Throughout the day, they kept busy, yard work, grocery shopping, planning meals for the week. The energy between them was lighter now that unspoken feelings had been defined and understood. When Mark returned Sunday evening, he noticed the easy rhythm in their movements, the way David spoke openly, the way Emily looked relaxed rather than cautious. Later that night, David paused before heading upstairs and said, "I'm glad you're here." It was simple, direct, and full of meaning. Emily responded with equal simplicity. "I'm glad too." There was no drama, no confusion, no lines crossed. Instead, there was clarity. David finally understood that connection does not have to threaten boundaries, it can strengthen them. He saw Emily not as someone stepping into a role that wasn't hers, but as someone choosing to care in a steady, respectful way. And Emily realized that the key to building trust in a blended family is not grand gestures but calm conversations when storms roll in. As the house settled into peaceful quiet once more, both carried a deeper sense of security. The bond between them had been tested by vulnerability and strengthened by honesty. What once felt fragile now felt defined. And sometimes, that definition is what turns uncertainty into something solid enough to stand on. Spring settled fully over their small Oregon town, bringing clear skies, fresh air, and a feeling of renewal that matched the quiet transformation inside the house, because what had once been a place of careful steps and guarded words had become a home filled with steady conversation and shared purpose. David moved through the rooms with more ease now, no longer disappearing behind closed doors, and Emily noticed how naturally he included her in small details about his day, from internship updates to random stories about friends, and each time he spoke openly it felt like another brick placed in the foundation they had been building for months. One Friday afternoon, David came home holding an envelope, his expression a mix of nerves and hope, and without even taking off his shoes he found Emily in the kitchen and handed it to her. It was the official internship offer from a marketing firm in downtown Portland, the same one he had doubted he was ready for, and when she read the letter her eyes filled with proud tears because she remembered the night he almost didn't apply, convinced he wasn't good enough. "You pushed me," he said softly, not meaning pressure but encouragement. Emily shook her head and smiled. "You pushed yourself. I just reminded you that you could." That evening, Mark suggested celebrating at a small family-owned restaurant near the river, and as they sat together at the table, laughing and planning the summer ahead, David looked around and realized something important. He no longer felt like he was protecting his heart from this family, he felt part of it. Later that week, as David prepared for his first day at the internship, nerves returned, but instead of isolating himself, he walked into the kitchen where Emily was packing his lunch in a reusable container, a simple habit she had started months ago. "You don't have to do that," he said with a half-smile. "I know," she replied gently. "I want to." He paused, then admitted he was scared of failing in a real workplace, scared of being seen as inexperienced. Emily reminded him that everyone starts somewhere and that growth only happens when you step into rooms that challenge you. Her words were calm, not dramatic, but they carried weight because he trusted her. On his first morning, as he stood at the front door adjusting his tie, he looked back at her and said, "That day with the pie, I didn't just taste dessert. I felt like I belonged." Emily felt her chest tighten with emotion, but she kept her voice steady. "That was always the point," she answered. When the door closed behind him, she stood still for a moment, realizing that what they had built was not fragile anymore, it was steady, defined by respect and care. Weeks passed quickly. David threw himself into work, learning fast, staying late some evenings, coming home with stories about presentations and new ideas. He began to carry himself differently, shoulders straighter, voice more confident. Mark noticed it too and often exchanged grateful glances with Emily, understanding that her patience had played a quiet role in this growth. One Sunday afternoon, David invited a few colleagues over for a small backyard barbecue. As laughter filled the yard and music played softly, one of his co-workers asked how long Emily had been his stepmom. David answered without hesitation, long enough to change my life. The words were simple, spoken casually, but they landed deeply. Emily pretended not to react, focusing on setting out plates, yet inside she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. That night, after everyone left and the house returned to calm, David helped her clean up. "I used to think family was something fixed," he admitted while drying dishes. "Like it either worked or it didn't. I didn't know it could grow." Emily nodded, explaining that family is often built in moments of choice, when people decide to show up for each other again and again. He looked thoughtful, then said, "You showed up when you didn't have to." She responded gently, "I wanted to." There was no awkwardness, no confusion, only clarity. The connection they shared was rooted in guidance, trust, and mutual respect. Months later, as summer turned warm and golden, David received praise from his internship supervisor and even talk of a future job offer. He came home one evening with excitement in his voice and hugged both his father and Emily tightly. In that embrace, there was gratitude, not dependency, appreciation, not confusion. Emily understood then that her role had never been about filling a space left behind, it was about standing beside him as he stepped forward. On a quiet night near the end of summer, she baked the apple cinnamon pie again, not because anything was wrong but because traditions now carried meaning. David joined her without being asked, moving confidently through the recipe he had memorized. As the pie baked, he leaned against the counter and said, "You know, I was surprised that day because I didn't expect kindness without strings." Emily met his eyes and replied, "Kindness doesn't need strings." When the timer rang and the warm scent filled the kitchen once more, they shared a slice at the table, sunlight fading through the windows just like that first afternoon. But this time, there was no distance left to cross. The house felt whole. The silence that once defined their relationship had been replaced by steady understanding. And as David talked about future plans, maybe New York, maybe starting his own company one day, Emily listened with quiet pride, knowing that sometimes the smallest offer can begin the biggest change. What started with a simple invitation to taste something sweet had grown into something lasting, not dramatic or loud, but strong, healthy, and real.